Welcome back to another episode of FPO and G, Financial Planning for Oil and Gas Professionals. This week on the podcast, we're going to talk about Europe, we're going to talk about tipping, and we're going to talk about the overrated exercise of picking the optimal city to live in. Justin, I'm kind of bummed. It was a missed opportunity for last episode. For the four of you who watch on YouTube, I had a really terrible background that wasn't my conventional background because I was recording our podcast in Cologne, Germany. And some of our clients already know, but I've spent the last 20 days in Europe. Went to 4 countries. We went to Belgium, we went to the Netherlands, we went to England, and we went to Germany. And my sister-in-law got married there. I was lucky enough to officiate the wedding. And it was a lot of fun, but it was chaos. And it was me, my wife, and our 16-month-old. And we got back stateside a couple of days ago. So everything is still fresh. So I thought now would be a good time to just kind of rant about some of the cultural differences.
Jared, can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
Cologne, Germany. Is this like Champagne, France? Is this the origin of Cologne, or is it totally different?
You know, I don't know that, honestly.
Okay.
Yeah,
Maybe
I don't know.
Listeners knows about Cologne, Germany.
Somebody tell us, because I clearly don't after spending 4 days there. I will say travel with a 16-month-old, it wasn't the most rewarding vacation in terms of historical, scratching the historical itches.
There you go.
You have a finite amount of attention and energy and being able to sit still. So, Justin, have you ever been to Europe?
Yes, not often. I've been once.
Yeah. How old were you when you went?
I was 23, I believe.
Yeah. If you had to think about what was like the biggest cultural difference or like thing that stuck in your mind about the way Europeans, and I use European and British interchangeably, you know, the UK, and I know post Brexit, just for simplicity of conversation purposes, I mean both of those things.
You know, it was actually a pretty funny trip. So I was going to India to visit some friends that were doing mission work in India, and I spent like a day or two in a layover in London. So I was actually alone in Europe just doing this layover. And to make it even more kind of strange, it was Christmas Eve. So I went to the Christmas service at what's the famous church in London, Westminster Abbey? Is that correct?
We'll go with that. I don't know.
And so I'm on this layover. So Jared, I'm actually living out of my backpack. Just for a day. You know, I checked bags to get to America. So I just have a like massive backpack. And you know, the interesting thing was for this Christmas service, I had to use the restroom. So I sat down in this, you know, beautiful old cathedral, and I put my backpack there and I go use the restroom. Well, I come back, you know, 2 minutes later, and there are police and a crowd around our seat because they think that I'm a terrorist. They think this backpack is a bomb. And so, you know, I might have ruined the Christmas service at Westminster Abbey circa 2011 or somewhere around there. But all that to say, you know, other than that, London was really fantastic. Beautiful city, and would love to spend more time there at some point.
Wow. Short amount of time there. High impact.
That's
in
right.
terms of infamy. Yeah. So just a couple of interesting things that I want to just kind of, and this is kind of connected to, I mean, all of this is fresh because I know we just had a conversation about die with zero, right? One of the things I noticed is that all the groups of Americans that I saw were mostly gray haired. And, you know, candidly, I never would have taken this trip unless my sister-in-law was getting married across the pond, right? It's a seemingly insurmountable thing to sign you, your wife, and your 16-month-old for multiple weeks flying across to Europe. It's just, you know, it was really refreshing, but it wasn't relaxing, to use that word. But I was sad when I got there because I noticed, you know, the average group of Americans, it was, you know, generally, not quite elderly, but slower moving, older groups of friends. And it was cool that they were doing that and making time for that. But there was a part of me that lamented, man, you know, we went to a bunch of different countries, saw a bunch of different people, all the people with kids, because inevitably every city we went in, we were seasoned vets at the playgrounds, you know, had a very good lay of the land in terms of the playground situation. Very few tourists that were our age. And it made me sad. I'm like, man, how cool would it have been to you know, do these trips earlier with your friends when you have a little more energy and mobility? Because man, even at our age, it's taxing.
That's such a good point. And Yeah, I mean, that makes sense, but that's an interesting observation. And I guess, certainly October is a difficult time for younger people to get away. But that is contrary to Die with Zero for sure.
Okay, another thing makes me sad. The first time I went to Europe, I was this is my fifth trip. So first time I was 13 years old. So I've been going a while. Tipping has caught on, and it saddens me a little. I know we're going to talk about tipping as its own counterpoint in the podcast, but it exists in Europe more so than it has historically. But generally, it's a service charge that's fixed and set, and we'll have a philosophical debate as to whether or not that even is a tip. But and in percentage wise, it's a more reasonable 8 to 12%. Something that I think we should adopt from the Europeans. All the prices are inclusive of that, of taxes, right? It is just so much easier to navigate a menu when there's fewer variables to solve, right? It's just like, hey, it's going to be, if it's $10 plus $10 and then 20% VAT, much easier to figure out. It's $8 versus $8 plus 8% sales tax plus 10% service charge, right? It's like, I don't want to have to do a math equation. I love the simplicity of that idea.
Yeah, I'm excited to dive into tipping as its own topic. That's interesting to hear that it's kind of toned down a little bit, but it also has caught on much more than it previously had.
Yeah. So next point I have, I've talked about this before, not maybe not on this podcast, but I've had this idea before, but it's really illuminated. Work-cations are underrated, right? You, me, and Nathan own this business, and it's really hard to turn it off, right?
Yeah.
So what I decided to do is I decided to go for an extended period of time and work, during that. And it's lifestyle compatible. If you have young kids who are napping, it's a great idea, right? Because I get a segment during the day where I get to work. I work a little bit in the afternoon while they're at the playground, and then work in the evening when they go to bed, which is actually kind of the end of the American workday, right? So we were gone for over 20 days, but I worked, and I wasn't working full time, but I was working that time, and ideally, I get that you do need time to turn completely off, but I found myself so much less stressed knowing that work wasn't just accumulating and piling up. It was a little bit, but I was getting my highest and most important stuff done. So it was just a very much more manageable way to travel, and knowing, hey, I had time to move the ball forward and get a few days in all the places that we wanted to. So I think the idea of a workcation is underrated, and I'm a big fan of that.
That is so true. Jared, it hit me. I took the trip, took my family to the beach, a few months ago. And Jared, that was the first time that I took any sort of vacation that wasn't like Thursday night to Tuesday morning. So just kind of making a long weekend. And I believe that was the first time I had done a pure vacation that wasn't just a long weekend since we started BWM. And, I liked it. It was great, but I would emphatically reiterate what you just said. Like, I don't feel like I've missed out at all because I've done plenty of workations during that time. We've done multiple ski trips looped in on work trips. We've visited family looped in on work trips. So I agree. Workations are awesome. And they're just fantastic.
Yeah. Okay. The other interesting thing, this is an investment podcast, so we do have to have some investment components here. I felt the valuation difference. So let me tell you what I mean by that. So if you look at European equities compared to the price of U.S. equities, the dollar you're paying for earnings in the country, there's a substantial discount in European equities relative to the U.S. But in my mind, what I mean when I say the valuation makes sense to me, I felt it was, man, culturally, productivity is just lower on their totem pole. Right. Everywhere we went, places had weird hours. Like, no one was in a rush. Right. Like, everybody, like, there was no turning of tables. You always have to ask for a bill to check out. Like, we would go to a restaurant at like 5 o'clock, and they would say, hey, like, do you have a reservation? No. And then they would say, hey, we can give you this table, but we're going to need it back by 7:30. And it's like, hey, mister, I appreciate that, but we have a 16-month-old, so we're going to be lucky if we get 45 minutes eating our food standing up.
Yeah.
But it was just like this cultural thing of like, hey, whoever has that table for the night has it for the night, right? There's no like efficiency of, hey, how could we turn more tables? How could we serve more people? How could we, be a little more productive? Hey, what would sales look like if we expanded hours more, right? Like, a lot of places would open at 9 and close at 5, right? Like retail spaces, like in city centers. And I was just kind of really surprised by that. And so I did think it was interesting to just say, hey, they're American countries or American companies have a valuation premium because they're more efficient in allocating capital, but also because I would say the U.S. is more productive, and culturally we have a higher emphasis on productivity.
Jared, a couple months ago, I heard Scott Galloway mention in a podcast that the US is still the greatest place to make money in the world, and Europe is the greatest place to spend money.
That was on my list, Justin. That framework is so good. I think
Yeah.
that's just like a really helpful way to like think about kind of the cultural differences, because I mean like leisure, relaxation, community, like taking things slow. Like there's merits to both. I wouldn't say there's one that's right or the other, one that's right and one that's wrong. Like at different times, you yearn for different ones for sure.
Yeah.
But I think that framework is just like such a good one. I actually was able to meet up with a friend of mine who's relocated to London, and he and his wife both work for a company. It's based in Dallas, and they acquired an office in Paris, and one of they're responsible for the integration. And one of the things they were talking about is how it's a very brutal job because the people they're reporting to are Americans, and the people that are working that are reporting to them are Europeans. So they catch themselves in it. That's a precarious spot to be in, and it just illuminates this idea of like, hey, there's just kind of a cultural disconnect in terms of, hey, how high does optimization and productivity sit on the cultural totem pole?
That is a very interesting dynamic. I also thought it was fascinating that Galloway went deeper into his point, and I think tell me if I'm getting this right, but I think a big part of his thought was that in Europe, wealth has been created and it's no longer being created. So current wealth creation isn't happening at a high clip, and so a lot of the careers, a lot of the jobs that you would do in Europe are kind of handling wealth that's already been created. There's not a ton of job creation. There's not a whole lot of innovation. Whereas in the US, it's still the greatest place ever to start a business in insert any of the 10 or 11 industries in the US economy.
Yeah, think about FANG, right? Think about the AI boom. Think about all the global tech superpowers, right? Google, Facebook,
Oh,
Netflix,
yeah.
Amazon. Yeah, name 3 outside of America.
Yeah. Great exercise. Pretty much impossible.
But the interesting thing is, being globally diversified investors, does that mean you shouldn't own Europe? And all of that information is being reflected into the price of European stocks. So like Europe doesn't need to become America to have really good investment returns. And the other interesting thing is if you look at like we've had a strong dollar the last decade. So that's actually also made returns ex-US worse, right? With a strong dollar. So if there's any bit of currency move, if things, right, all of this is embedded in the price. We're not saying we're not portraying an edge that is an actionable thing. It's just, hey, this is why I think there's a valuation discount, and there's not much that needs to happen for that to maybe not even for it to be eliminated, but to shrink to more historical averages, or just get a little help from currency. So I was very interesting being there and having that just kind of just feeling that idea, because you hear we talk about valuation a lot, and just interesting to see, hey, this kind of makes sense intuitively. It feels right.
Jared, that's an interesting point, and I kind of want to highlight it again that you really just laid out a case that you would never want to invest in Europe. But then no, that's not how the market works. The market already knows everything you just said, and it's already been priced in, which kind of takes me back to one of my favorite stocks of the last 20 years and the story behind this stock, Domino's. So Domino's is one of the few companies that, I mean, really has rivaled FANG, for a large part of the 2010s. And, the thing of when I think about Domino's, I think, okay, well, back in 2009, 2010, they were making really bad pizza, right? And they weren't doing a great job selling this bad pizza. So the stock price was really low. So how in the world did Domino's, explode in value? Because no offense, to them or any of their any big Domino's fans out there, but man, Jared, I still think they're making pretty bad pizza. But they
We might have to add that to the lightning pod future topics because I think it's pretty solid. But keep going.
really, what, Jared? You think it's pretty solid? I mean, I feel like you have very high taste when it comes to food, so I'm surprised that we disagree on this. Uh, okay, yeah, we might need to add this to a future lightning round, little bit of a pizza review. But it's not as if you think about the trajectory of that stock, and hey, it did take off, but maybe they were just making bad pizza a little bit better and getting far more efficient with it. So you don't necessarily need to have something bad that turns into the greatest thing ever for the stock to 100x. And so we'll be interested to see what European returns and all international returns look like moving forward.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's like just the current reality is extrapolated indefinitely into the future, right? So if I'm a C student, the market's going to bet that I'm going to continue to get C's. But if I get a C plus, there might be a little upside surprise, right?
Yes.
But if I'm an A plus plus student that's passed all the AP exams and all that stuff, it's like that's the bar you're set to. So you have to continue to do that going forward. Otherwise, you're going to get punished for it. So it's basically just extrapolating what's presently going on into the future indefinitely.
Yep.
The final thing I'll say about Europe, here's the thing. Food is wild, right? I ate a ton of things. I have a sensitive stomach and I was pretty careless in Europe. And it didn't matter, right? I think one of the things Europeans have cracked the code on is making sure that there's a base amount of toxins that can't go into food. And if you look at the ingredients of their food, and even if you look at American Doritos and Doritos in the UK, very different ingredient lists. And so I envy them. I felt really good eating all kinds of food. This isn't a food podcast, but I think if you look historically, our diets, eat a lot of meat, a lot of eggs, a lot of bread, those things haven't changed. We've been eating those for thousands of years. I think what's changed is all the additives and stuff. And it was really just refreshing to be in a place where there's just simplicity of ingredients, and a certain amount of stuff that couldn't, some of the stuff that can't even go in there, because it's a known carcinogen or toxin.
Yeah, that's pretty unbelievable. You said this isn't a food podcast. Maybe it should be. I think I might enjoy that. Did we talk about planes yet and kind of private equitization of flights?
No, Justin, you and I were talking about this before, but like I said earlier, the first time I went on an airplane was, not an airplane to Europe. I was 13, and I am 31 now. So it's a lot of time has passed. But what I was telling Justin is the composition of coach flights to premium flights. And of course, there's a bunch of difference. There's first, there's business, there's premium economy, right? There's the mix of that. And of course, this is just an estimation, but if I had to estimate the first flight I went on, the mix of premium to coach, it was probably 25% premium, 75% coach. And the last flight I went on, it felt like the inverse. It felt like 75% was premium. And of course, a small percentage was first. A small percent was business, some was first. There's a good expanded premium economy section. It felt like economy. I had to walk towards the very back of the plane, and there was just one little odd of really condensed seats. And so I was just really surprised because it was man, it felt, we've talked about this idea before, but private equitization of private equity, hey, optimizing value extraction and lifetime value, increasing the value per customer, right? And as I was sitting on the airplane and coach thinking about how much of this airplane wasn't coach, I was just thinking about the McKinsey consultants that probably met with all these airlines, basically running them through the economics of, hey, what is my total addressable market? Who's doing transatlantic travel? How much can they pay per seat? If we do convert these number of seats, what's the price we have to pay to get them there? But it was a really stark example of how, the private equitization of, and that's private equity isn't the only, they are probably doing it best, but they're not the only people doing it. It's all over America. But this idea of how do I move up the value chain so I can get higher margin, higher expense stuff into the pockets of consumers? I felt that in a very tangible way being on this airplane in the very back in the tiny little economy section.
Yep, we should try to find that article and link it, not to pub my own work and my own article. I think it's one of the greatest ideas I've ever shared. I don't think I was succinct enough in sharing it, but Jared, that idea that everything in our economy, everything that you as a person or as a family have to buy, it has been touched by this idea that a consultant or a private equity firm has figured out a way to charge three times as much and deliver a worse product. And so, yeah, that's interesting that you feel that on flights. And I mean, I would emphatically agree. Flying is just awful. JSX is I think it's the biggest innovation in the marketplace of the last decade plus. But I'm worried they're going to get pummeled by bigger airline lobbyists. And I also just, you already see it. Heading to Houston next week, and they've taken away the early midweek Dallas to Houston direct flight. And so, yeah, there's just not a great solution there.
Yeah. Yeah. But hey, if your kid's under 2, they fly free. So if you're thinking about taking a trip with young families, now's the time to do it. Because if like a transatlantic flight, even if they have the orange seat, we did not do that. We had him on our laps. And that was interesting, but luckily he slept a good bit on both legs. All right, Justin, this is kind of Europe adjacent, but question for you: is tipping out of control? And then 2, how do you define tipping?
Tipping is so far out of control. It's absolutely absurd. Now I say that, I mean, personally, every single time I feel this tension and I'm thinking, man, this is absurd. And I'm still a pretty big tipper because at the end of the day, I'm still looking at this dynamic and I'm thinking, hey, if you're a waiter or waitress, you're kind of dependent on this. And if a restaurant is moving toward this and they're tipping their staff, I mean, they're not paying their staff much. And so, yeah, that's the tension I feel, Jared. I think tipping's totally out of control. You tip absolutely everywhere now. But maybe I'm part of the problem because I still do it.
No, I think you captured something that's important, the tension of it, right? Because like the problem is like the service has been bifurcated from the cost of production, right? So like restaurants don't price things with service embedded, right? So you have to pay for service, but historically that price has been inclusive of service. So when you tipped, it was like, hey, the service was above and beyond, or it was exemplary, or hey, I'm grateful. I'm grateful in excess of like you did more than just bring me the thing. And so I think like in that sense, it's like, hey, I love tipping and I love like the idea of tipping, but I think it's gotten totally out of control, right? Like a great example of this, like, and I've thought about this, like if I have to make a decision on tipping and the quality of service before I even receive the good I've paid for, what even is tipping?
Yes. Great point.
Right? Like I go to a kiosk, I order something and I haven't even gotten the thing yet. And I'm supposed to give you a tip based on how I think it might be. What if it's the worst thing in the entire world?
But then, Jared, it adds to that dynamic that you order food to go, let's say online, and you have to decide what your tip is going to be well before you even get to the restaurant to pick up this food. It's then a kind of a social contract that is, hey, I'm tipping you. I'm kind of bribing you to like do a good job making my food. They're going to see the order when it comes in, right? And so that, like, I feel that tension too. It's like, well, I have to tip. I mean, they're going to see this order to go. And if I don't, put 20% on there, they're not going to make it as good as they could.
Yeah. And like, you have to pick the tip and like they move the screen to you and you pick the tip. But like when you send it back to them, the total amount is there. So it's not like they don't see it. That's just total theatrics to make you feel like you're totally tipping obscurely and they don't see it.
Yeah. Great point.
But so tipping is tipping out of control, yes. But I also think restaurants are fundamentally broken, right? Like the average profit margin is less than 5%. It's almost like they're a social good, right? Like you don't get into restaurant touring because it's insanely lucrative or profitable, right? Like it is emphatically a labor of love. Like when your profit margin isn't even double digits, and like I think about just how crazy the restaurant dynamic and how many variables you're managing is. It's like, man, I don't really have any good solutions. Yeah, I think tipping's out of control. I would rather increase food prices that reflect a fair wage for the people, so you get a better idea of whether or not you can actually afford it, and that so there's an incentive in place to like actually tip above and beyond. Is kind of what I would do. But again, kind of like you're talking about, it's like, hey, this is these people's livelihood. These businesses aren't really compelling businesses to own in terms of financial arrangement. So like I kind of like the idea of like, hey, let's better reflect it in the price versus this black box of tipping for services that haven't even been rendered.
Jared, that's a really interesting framing. I think I've seen a real estate developer on Twitter share this idea that if you are like everybody wants to live in a place where there's awesome coffee shops, restaurants, wine bars right by where you live, right? That's the most desirable area. People want to live in that spot. But the interesting thing is those restaurants don't make any money. The people who actually economically benefit are the people who own the real estate around there. And it's almost like framing restaurants in that way. It's almost like they're little local bookstores that, I mean, there's no way they're making any money. Like Amazon killed that idea decades ago. And it's kind of just like a benevolent business that a local wealthy person runs because it's charming. I mean, yeah, like Jared, the analogy is, or kind of a direct example. Have you eaten at State of Grace down in Houston
I
on
have, yeah.
Boulevard? Okay, love State
Yeah.
of Grace.
So good.
Awesome restaurant. And there's like River Oaks had a little, I think it's out of business now, which is too bad. There was a little bookstore in that same development, right by the Sid Mashburn. You know, that restaurant, I have no idea if they're making any money, but like the people who benefit are the ones who own the incredible real estate, 1, 2 blocks north in between there and the whole neighborhood. So kind of an interesting dynamic, just like you said, that it's almost as if all restaurants are like local bookstores. Like they're not making money, but they make a place so much better to live in.
Yeah. And so, right, like I think it gets back to like the disconnection of like, it's interesting because like tipping's out of control, but it's not like restaurateurs are benefiting from it.
Yeah.
Right? It's not like their margins have expanded tremendously.
Yeah.
But I do think, right, like if I'm going to run for director of restaurateur office, whatever that is, I would say, hey, I'm happy to have food with a sticker price that's 30-40% higher because it's inclusive of service and tax. So like I'm not doing a math equation to know what it's actually going to cost me. And so like I think that's where tipping got astray. It's like it's just like in light of the dynamics, it's hard not to tip.
Jared, I wonder if at some point we will see legislation on this. I mean, there was, I think, multiple states that passed legislation where Airbnb cannot bifurcate all their different fees. They have to show the all-in fee when you go. So you no longer can you click on an Airbnb and it says 130 a night, and then you go to checkout and it's actually 310 a night. And so, yeah, you never know that could legitimately change in some states.
Yeah. The old bait and switch. Justin, let's pivot because we're running long on time to the last topic, which is, and I'll say what I think it is, but you can kind of clarify. Like the idea of it's an overrated exercise to find the optimal city to live in, and like I'll just pass the ball over to you. Is that what do you mean by that? And did I, summarize that accurately?
I think you summarized it really well. And so this, there's kind of all these online debates, if you're on X or anywhere else or Twitter, where people will like show a picture of, say, Cleveland, Ohio. And then everyone will talk about how much it sucks and how much it would be terrible to live there. And Jared, my hot take with that is, you know what? Unless you are dealing with like $30 million to spend, and you're just, you're getting the most unbelievable place in Santa Monica, in another place in, lower Manhattan or something. Everywhere's kind of the same. And Jared, I remember having a conversation with my brother about this like a decade ago, and he always loved Chicago. And, he sent me a picture of the lake in Chicago. And I looked at that and I remember thinking, you know what? If you moved to Chicago, you were going to be on a boat on this lake once every 3 years. It will have no impact on your life whatsoever. Like you will never be doing this. And so it kind of hints at the idea that wherever you live, I mean, your experience is kind of summed up by the house you live in and the restaurants or coffee shops that are nearby you. And, unless you're, I don't know, Jared, right there on Malibu and your beachfront, right on the sand, there's just not going to be a massive difference whether you're in Wichita or Chicago. So maybe that's my hot take. What do you think?
I agree and I disagree. And the caveat I would add is assuming your city has at least 1 million people in the metro area.
Okay.
Because like there's a big difference between living in a town and a city, right? If you think about it, like I live in Bella Vista, Arkansas, which is a retirement community
Not a
about,
million.
yeah, not a million in the metro area. My closest Whole Foods is 45 minutes. My closest Target is 25 minutes. And I have three restaurants within a 10-minute radius of me, a Dairy Queen and two local chains I wouldn't be caught dead at. Right. So like my lived experience is like if I live in Cleveland or if I live in New York and I live in a dense, cool part of town per se, like I have local wine bars, I have craft breweries, I have all those things. It's just, 30 minutes in the car versus 5 to 10. So like, if I think comparing cities, yes, but when you go from like a town to a city, that's a pretty big level up. But assuming that you live in a dense metro area with an airport with over 50 direct flights and a decent enough food and culture and art scene that comes with having at least a million people in the metro area, I think tomatoes, tomatoes, and I think the lifestyle you design within that city is actually more important than the city you pick.
Okay, that's good. Jared, I'm going to give something specific and tell me if I'm barking up the right tree here. I mean, you know where I live in Fort Worth, and I am a massive fan of Fort Worth. I think it's just an awesome place to be. But with in less than a mile from my house, I can go to my golf course. I can walk to four different wine bars, coffee shops, awesome restaurants. Like the area is awesome. Jared, Nashville has kind of become just the coolest, most popular place in America. I would, just I would bet anything that my lived experience in a really awesome and like all the homes have character, there's trees, it's charming. I would say that where I'm at in Fort Worth is just infinitely cooler than some suburb 30 minutes away from Nashville. And I would like argue that just to the max. Like it's not even a contest. What do you think?
Yeah, but I think that's where you get led astray. Is if you say, "Hey, I'm fixated on this place," you'll do whatever you can to get in the place, not thinking about, "Hey, like the street you live on and the surrounding mile makes a great deal of difference." Because it's kind of like what you're alluding at. It's like if I'm fixated on living in Nashville, and so I live in the suburbs, like outside of town, and like I'm not connected to my neighbors, and there's no like character and like local coffee shops or local restaurants or anything. Like, it doesn't matter that I live in a quote cooler city. My lived experience in that city is I've configured it to where it's going to be really suboptimal. Um,
Okay, another hot take off of what you just said. Let's say that you have a home budget of 700,000, which, 10 years ago you were just buying a mansion, and today in most cities you're not. But let's say you have a budget of 700,000, Jared. I would vehemently argue so much that you would have a way more enjoyable time taking that budget to St. Louis, Missouri than you would San Francisco, California.
I emphatically agree. No, I think that's right. Value, right? Because in the scenario you just outlined, you can live in the coolest part of the less cool city
Yeah,
versus the least cool and unsafe part of the coolest city.
bingo.
Right. And so I do think you're onto something there. I think something we didn't address is like family. Family really matters. Right. And I do think like it's worth taking a step back and saying in the hyper individualistic American culture, right? Because like we're helping clients think through this. Like, where do I want to be? What environment do I want to be in? I think there's something to be said about, hey, in light of this reality that like the variance in cities kind of overrated, like be where your people are.
Yeah.
And I think like Aaron and I, we don't live by either side of our parents, and our son is the first grandkid on either side, and so like we're really starting to, and millennials are very hyper individualistic, hyper fixated on, hey, what's the best spot for me to be in, and it's like, hey, what you're alluding to, cities are more similar than they're not, right? Like you're going to go to the art museums, you're going to go to the local restaurants, you're going to go to local coffee shops, you're going to go to their botanical gardens, right? Like there's zoos. There's not that much variance in all of those things. So just find a spot in a place where you can be in a cool part of town that you enjoy with people you love. Like I really think it's that simple, but like all these best places to live lists, I think can totally, totally miss that.
Yes, that's so good. Jared, can I get your thoughts on a real quick news article?
Yeah.
Okay, so saw this article, kind of blew me away. Dude Perfect. Are you familiar with what Dude Perfect is?
Oh yeah, the trick shots, man. They were like the OG of like making trick shot videos.
Yes. So it's a YouTube channel. I think there's four of them. My kids are obsessed with them. My kids love these guys. They're just making trick shot videos on YouTube, football, basketball, baseball, every sport. And they received a $100 million investment. And so, Jared, I think a couple things. One, I'm going to kind of give you a hot take. I think all of the Dude Perfect guys are probably billionaires. Now, the difficult part of this is like, how do you value their brand? Like you could value their brand at 800 million, or you could value their brand at like 28 billion. And frankly, I think you could kind of come up with a rational defense of either anything in that spectrum. So one, I think the Dude Perfect guys are billionaires, which is crazy. Two, article shared something that who knows how they value this, but the creator economy. So I guess people that are influencers making YouTube channels, they said that they valued that whole entire market at about $250 billion, and they expect it to be $500 billion within a year or two. What do you think about that, Jared?
It's a wazi, it's a woozy. Dude, I have no idea how you evaluate that stuff, right? But here's
Yeah,
the thing: like eyeballs and attention are really valuable,
yeah,
right? Like people who build brands, like I'm just fast. And here's the thing: like if you think about Dude Perfect, they could build they could have a stadium, they could have an event center, they could do branding, they could do licensing deals, they could recommend products, right? There's tons of ways to monetize that brand, and they've already done that. But like backing into these valuations, it's like it's kind of insane to me, right? Like I don't know, like I don't know how you get there, and I don't like even if these guys are billionaires, I don't know how you get Dude Perfect to make billions of dollars over its lifetime.
yeah.
And like okay, I get that that there are ways it can be done, but I'm glad I'm not the person figuring it out. I do think it's interesting. I do think it's really fun, but I just also like it's kind of insane to me. And it, like, and I wonder the people buying it, are they buying it so that someone else buys it down the road for a higher valuation?
Great
Or
question.
are they buying it because they've actually done a discounted cash flow analysis in light of all the revenue streams and they think
They
it's
want
fair value? Because
cash in perpetuity.
yeah,
You know,
so like, are you buying a business with the underlying cash flows? Or are you buying an asset that is like almost like a collectible that like you think someone else will pay more for later? Which, to be clear, is can be a worthwhile, right? Like I think a lot of sports teams, like if you look at the underlying economics of them relative to the valuations they command, it's not like these things print money, right? Especially with how much the valuations have risen over time. Um, but like that doesn't mean there's not value for it. And I think there's something to be said about like some people want to be the people that just own the things, right? Like, hey, we have an equity investment in Dude Perfect. And you think about the fund who did it. I have no idea who they are. Like they'll list that on the top of their portfolio. And when that private equity company gives a call about a funding round, like they might be, they might be more interested because, oh, these guys have worked with Dude Perfect. So there's just so many different incentives and things to be aware of and motivations that it's like, it's just so hard. It's impossible to unearth whether or not it's a good investment. But it's fascinating. What would you say?
I think I agree with everything you said. High Mount Capital is the group that provided that investment. So kind of interesting. Jared, maybe FPOG at some point is like Dude Perfect, and we're just doing concert tours. We're selling sweatshirts. I don't think that'll be the case, but you never know.
I do know that if we have a potato gun shooting merch out of it, that we've strayed very far from the light of what we initially sought to do, which is
Wow.
help oil and gas investors make better financial planning decisions. So we're just kind of tinkering with the format a little bit, and we love to just riff on news. So if you have any articles you want our thoughts on, definitely shoot them over to us. Always love hearing from our listeners. Podcast at brownleewealthmanagement.com. Thanks. We'll see you next time.